Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. In this very special episode of Ameritocracy, I traveled to Sacramento to meet with Dan Walters, one of California's most syndicated columnists and author. He covered the state's political scene since 1975, with over 33 years at the Sacramento Bee, and currently writes for CalMatters. Dan shares his insights on California's evolution from a Republican-leaning to solidly Democratic state, shaped by shifts in industry and demographics. He highlights the state's heavy reliance on high-income taxpayers, which makes its budgets vulnerable to economic swings, and delves into the pressure and the issues like education, transportation, and housing affordability that jeopardize the state's future. With over 50 years in journalism and 4 books on California politics, Dan brings a seasoned perspective on the policies shaping the state's economic and political trajectory. I hope you enjoy. Good morning, Dan. How you doing?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming down here.
Sure.
Yeah, it's been a bit since I've been down to Sacramento, and it looks a little bit more packed. I think the last time I was up here was during the pandemic, so it seems like things are starting to get a little bit back to normal.
Yeah,
here.
well, downtown Sacramento, like a lot of downtowns, kind of became a ghost town during the pandemic. It was really kind of unfortunate because they had just kind of gotten the downtown Sacramento going with a new basketball arena and restaurants, and all of a sudden, bang, the COVID hit, and it just became like a ghost town there for a while.
Yeah, you and I were talking before we got on air here, and way back in my day, I was a newspaper carrier as a kid for the Press Enterprise and Riverside, and definitely loved newspapers, reading all the way through. And then about 2006, I went and ran for city council. And I remember I would always read your articles on different things that having to do with California, really trying to kind of get a beat on, things that are going on. And I know you and I talked about, used to have a lot of reporters, a lot more up here back in the day than they do now.
Yeah, that's it. The Capitol Press Corps at one time, I think it was around 75 people. And it's like, I don't know, a couple of dozen maybe. Mm-hmm. 30. And I think CalMatters, my employer, is probably half of it or more than half of the whole California Press Corps now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I live in an area that's covered by Orange County Register and the LA Times, and a lot of their stuff is syndicated. They don't really have reporters, from what I could tell, that are up here a lot. They run a lot of that, but I don't know. It's an honor to have you on the show. And the one thing that I thought was really interesting with your background is following you. I always had an appreciation for the number of years that you've been here and being able to see the different shifts and transitions of California. But I thought what would be interesting is to get, from your perspective, a little bit of an idea of a little bit of the history, the policy, the politics. And I thought it might be helpful too for the listeners to be able to kind of understand your background and how you got into reporting here, so that people that might be on the East Coast might not be familiar with some of your great work here.
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, I was interested in photography, and I changed high schools between my in the sophomore year. And I wanted to be the photographer for a student newspaper, and they already had one. So they said, if you got to work in a student newspaper, you got to write. Well, I didn't, I couldn't type. I didn't. So I more or less taught myself how to type with 5 fingers, and I still use that technique today. Anyway, I became the editor of the high school paper, and used to make the principal and the vice principal really mad. And I think, well, that's a lot of fun. That makes me feel bad. And so eventually I dropped out of high school, still another different high school, and went to work on a newspaper as a copy boy. And I was 16 years old. And actually I went to work and then tried to go to school for a few months after that, but it was kind of boring. So newspapers were more interesting than college or high school. And so I dropped out of high school and been doing it ever since. I guess.
You started in Eureka?
Yeah, at the Humboldt Times of Eureka in 1960.
Wow.
And Eureka was a 2-newspaper town in those days, a morning paper and afternoon paper, both owned by the same people. And I was on the morning paper, the Humboldt Times. And I transitioned into becoming a police reporter almost immediately. And it was fun, reporting's fun.
Yeah.
Newspapering's fun, and I still fun. And so I did it, and I went to another paper up in Oregon and knocked around a little bit, and eventually became the editor of one small newspaper and then another small newspaper, and actually wound up back in Eureka as the editor of that newspaper.
Oh, wow.
So it's 12 years later, or 12 years after the fact. And had a kind of a falling out with the publisher of the paper at that time and needed a job. And, you're fired, I quit business and went to work on the Sacramento Union. Had a friend that worked on the Union, and he got me on, and pretty quickly went to the Capitol and started covering the Capitol. And I've been doing it ever since for the Union. Started writing a column back in 81. Went over to the Sacramento Bee in 84. Myself and my column, and was at the Bee for 33 years. And 2017, I left the Bee, claimed my pension, and went to work for CalMatters, still writing the same column, basically. About 11,000 or so columns so far, something like that. I've kind of lost count, but it's in that neighborhood. And I write 4 columns a week for CalMatters. And it like all the other stuff that CalMatters does, is CalMatters is a nonprofit news organization. It distributes free of charge to the public, to other newspapers who can reprint what we do and everything. And that's what we do. And it's been a very interesting experience with watching this organization from almost nothing up to now we have about 100 people working there.
Wow. Yeah. When you moved over to CalMatters, moving away from the association of a big newspaper, were you concerned at all about the coverage that your columns would get, or were you already kind of knowing that they would syndicate some of your stuff?
Well, yeah, my column had been syndicated when I was at the Sacramento Bee. And so it kind of was the same spot, it's the same stuff. I'm no longer in the Bee, but other than that, I probably have more publication than I did when I was at the Bee, actually. I don't know. I don't even think about that kind of thing, to tell you the truth. I mean, I write it. Somebody wants to read it, that's fine. Somebody wants to pay me to write it, that's fine. It's just it is what it is. It goes on as long as it goes on.
So when you were writing crime, like you hear crime writers like Michael Conley started out as a beat writer and then ends up writing about crime. You started there, but then ended up in kind of politics and government. What drew you exactly into Sacramento? Like to be in, was that like something that you absolutely wanted to aspire to at the beginning? Or?
No, it wasn't. It was by accident because I just needed a job. And I had a family. I had two young children, and I needed a job after my last editorship in Eureka. And this job, I thought I would be here briefly until I found another small newspaper to become the editor of it. I wound up going to the Capitol, and I've been at the Capitol for almost 50 years.
Wow.
So I don't know. I guess I'm stuck in a rut.
In 1986, you wrote a book, and the book was The New California. And the thing that I found very interesting when I was doing the research is that, a little bit of the description is you traveled all 58 counties and went and really tried to get a perspective of what was going on in California. What was that experience like, and what did you gain from that?
Well, I had traveled into California quite a bit before that, and but I made a point of going everywhere, at least all 58 counties, and I was just trying to get a sense of where California was at that time, which was in the mid 80s, and kind of where we were going. Trying to figure out what the trends were, demography and the economy and politics, and it turned out to be pretty much as I wrote it at the time, where we were maybe a little faster than I thought it would occur, because there was a big upheaval in California, as we were talking earlier, in the mid 90s, when the Cold War ended, and it completely kind of decimated the aerospace industry in Southern California. There was a huge exodus out of California at the time, and of aerospace workers and their families, but also a huge flow into California from other countries at the time. So it transformed Los Angeles County and other places in Southern California, and had a pretty dramatic effect on politics. It was the beginning of the decline of the Republican Party in California, which had been very powerful for many, many years in California. I mean, you think about it, through the 20th century, I think California voted Democrat for president 3 times, maybe. I think it's 3 times, I think. I mean, it was a pretty Republican state at one time. And now it's obviously a deeply blue state. And that was the kind of the beginning of that with upheaval. And I hadn't foreseen that upheaval when I wrote the book. I was looking for other trends, such as migration and aging and other things, and the economic changes. And the aerospace industry got hit. It was kind of a really kind of out of left field sort of hit. Suddenly, you wouldn't expect something happening globally to have that such an effect, but it did, and it affected not only the demography and the culture of Southern California, but also the political aspect as well. It was a dramatic thing, and it's continuing on. It's still a dramatic thing.
Something I thought was fascinating, what you're saying too, is the change of the spending in aerospace. And I think, what was the metric you said back?
Well, at one time during the 80s, during the great defense buildup that Reagan had fostered during the 80s, the Pentagon was spending 20% of all its money in California.
Wow.
On military bases and military contracts, mostly the contracts. The bases are the most visible part of that. And when those bases started shutting down, like the Long Beach shipyard and, the Alameda, and I mean, all over the state, right here in Sacramento, we had 2 Air Force bases and an Army depot all shut down, for example, back in the 90s. And that had a cataclysmic effect on the economy and the culture and the politics of California. It transformed Los Angeles County from a neutral county, basically, politically speaking, into one that's very strongly Democratic. And in doing so, since Los Angeles County is a quarter of the state's population, shielded the entire state very dramatically and very suddenly.
Can you
and
talk
that's
a
been
little
going on ever since.
Can you talk a little bit about the theory you and I were mentioning about the fish hook?
Oh, the fish hook. Well, you have to use my hands to do it, but I'll
Sure.
Okay, California. Down the spine of California, from the Nevada-Arizona border all through the Central Valley, from Oregon all the way down to the Mexican border. You just take that whole swath of California, and then you hook into San Diego and Orange counties, and that used to be the Republican stronghold in California, and they called it the fish hook.
So 60s, 70s, 80s?
Yeah, all during that period, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s even.
Right.
And that would then compete with the very strong Democratic vote in the San Francisco Bay Area, more or less canceling each other out, but during that period with a slight advantage for Republicans. And then Los Angeles County was not a factor in those days because it was essentially neutral. It would not favor either party by enough to really tilt the state until the aerospace people left and were replaced by newcomers, and Los Angeles County, thanks to that, and also a very strong union movement that grew up in LA County during the 1990s, pushed LA County over into very strongly Democratic territory, and basically began the demise of the Republican Party in California.
Wow. Yeah, is that process, like you said, the aerospace workers realized they had great skill. The policies, a lot of the economics had changed, taxation, and they moved and they took their skills outside.
Yeah.
And you see a major shift too in the ability for California to keep certain talent. And it's kind of interesting too, is if you look at the budgeting process, you would think, this structure that we have in California is really focused on top earners. It's focused on being able to get the high income people that actually kind of pay almost 2/3 over half of the tax bill.
Here are the dynamics of the thing. Personal income taxes are about 3/4 of the state's general fund revenue. Now that wasn't true when I started covering the capital in the 70s. It was just the opposite. The sales tax was by far surpassed the income taxes at that time. But there was this evolutionary thing in taxes that nobody really ever understood for a long time. But the personal income tax became the dominant source of money for the state budget. And half of those income taxes are paid by 1% of taxpayers, the top 1% of taxpayers. About 150,000 people in a state of 40 million pay half of the state income taxes, which are 3/4 of the state budget. So yes, the budget is highly, and then you get down below that into the 2%ers and the thing. I mean, you get down to the top 5%ers. It's virtually all of it.
Right.
And so the state's budget, from which we finance schools and prisons and healthcare and a variety of other things, is very, very dependent on how well a handful of Californians are doing financially, particularly how they're doing on their investments, since much of their income is in the form of capital gains.
That's right.
So, and so it's a very volatile source of revenue, and it can go up and down like a yo-yo, and very often does. At the same time, however, the spending side of that ledger has become more ossified, more fixed, difficult to change, locked into the Constitution. It's like school finance, locked into the Constitution. So the spending side is very rigid, whereas the revenue side is very fluid. And so we periodically, because of that mismatch, we periodically have these budget crises, and like the one we're having now, and like global warming, it seems to get worse over time. It's not getting any better. We're becoming more and more dependent on that handful of people who, thankfully, are willing to stay in California and pay those taxes. We have the highest income tax rates, state income tax rates of any state. And now some of them leave, like Elon Musk did. Yeah. And there are others. It's a lot quieter, but there's a steady exodus of high income people out of California. One of the founders of CalMatters, the organization I work for, picked up her whole family, her husband and she and her husband and her whole family and his whole business moved to Texas very recently, for example, where there is no state income tax, or to Nevada, where there's no state income tax, or Florida, where there is no state income tax.
Yeah.
The more we are dependent on those folks, the more they're likely are to pack up and leave and take often not only their own incomes with them, but also their businesses with them. And that is a real serious problem that nobody wants to very much acknowledge. Well, it's acknowledged as a problem, but they don't want to try to deal with it because dealing with it would be politically very difficult. And so they don't. They just cross their fingers and hope that hope enough money comes in over the transom to finance the budget.
Can I ask you a question? So right now we're in the personal income tax model,
right?
But if you go back to the 60s and 70s, major infrastructure, highways, UC schools, Cal State schools, the water project, a lot of the stuff that we did was actually built on the back of like oil, petroleum and gas, those types of industries. And it's just kind of interesting that it's kind of shifted. The structure has shifted. So it's not like it couldn't move again, but there's been a history, and it's kind of interesting to watch like renewable energy, all that stuff, putting so much pressure on these different industries. And you wrote an article yesterday, I think it came out today. It was on the entertainment industry. And, and you talked about, the potential tax subsidy from, $300 600 something million to 700 million ish. And, you know, and your view is, and I really loved it, because the one thing that you said in there, you're like, you know, in total, this entertainment industry affects 125,000 people out of the 18 million people that potentially could be working. And so are we really focused on policies that are actually making the most difference? And I was just curious. Like,
the point of that thing was that there were many more, that the entertainment industry is famous. It has global cultural impact, movies and television done in Southern California. But from a purely economic standpoint, it's really pretty small. It's just hardly anything there. It's 125,000 workers. And as I mentioned, there's 18 million people in California are working at jobs or self-employed. And that's only 125,000. It's not even a drop in the bucket. So that there are much more important or economic sectors that are in doubt, such as the main industry of Southern California is actually logistics. It's the ports and all that cargo that comes in and out of the ports and all those warehouses that are out there in the Inland Empire and all the infrastructure, the trucking companies, the railroads, all the stuff. That's huge. It's about as huge as it can get. It is the biggest thing in Southern California. And it's in some peril for a variety of reasons. And if you're trying to get intervention to prop up an economic sector, that's a hell of a lot more important than the entertainment industry. But politicians like to schmooze with actors, and people in the movie business are big campaign contributors. And so that squeaking wheel gets the grease, whereas other squeaking wheels are kind of left to be neglected.
When you look at some of the structural stuff and, you know, things that could have more effect, like the logistics piece, you see a lot of the environmental regulations, different types of activity, zero carbon, which forces a lot of the trucking companies to switch out their equipment, potentially may or may not be able to afford it, all the labor activity. Do you think that at this point that the state is reacting to this in a way that's timely, or like you said, because I think what you just said, like the entertainment is a little bit of window dressing. It's not substantive, but it's materially affects maybe the image of California and maybe the image of politicians. But the you know, if you look, like you said, any of our tourism, logistics, all of those industries are, you know, really kind of counter to some of the policies. And I was just curious, like what you're seeing, you know, where do we go?
We're trying, I don't know, we is meaning me, but the state is trying to wean itself from fossil fuels in the name of climate change. It's an enormous thing. I mean, there are 30 million cars on the roads of California. And the governor says that after 2035, you can no longer going to buy a gasoline powered car in California. The chances of that actually happening are pretty small. But nevertheless, this transformation that the state is trying to do, including electric trucks and all sorts of things, has enormous costs and enormous perils, particularly in two industries that are so vital to California these days: the logistics in Southern California and the high-tech industry of the Bay Area. Those are the two most important economic mainstays of the state. And the distinguishing quality of those two sectors is they are involved globally, not just in California. And you take logistics, for example, shipping stuff through the ports of Long Beach and LA, and then the distributing it and all that logistics industry is a competitive global competitive situation. If somebody in China can ship it to some other place and transship it to the other places for 25 cents a ton less, they're going to do it because it's incredibly cutthroat business.
Right.
And the danger is that California, by raising the costs of operating in California, or by the more current thing of discouraging the construction of new logistics centers in California, we run the risk of getting to a tipping point in which California is no longer competitive, that it'll be more competitive to ship your stuff through the Panama Canal to the East Coast, or go around the other way, or do something else some other way, or go up to Seattle, or it's a very competitive business. And we mess with it and try to change it at our danger of actually wiping it out, because that can vanish almost overnight. And the same is true of the high tech industry in the Bay Area. The high tech industry is not expanding in California anymore. For example, Meta is building a huge data center in Indiana, not in California, but in Indiana. And you're seeing this spreading it out, going to places where the taxes aren't as high, where the labor costs are not as high, where housing costs are less, so I can pay my employees less, and they can still get a better deal on housing. All these factors, it's a very competitive business.
Right.
California, it sometimes has, at least the political California, has a tendency to take all of this for granted. That'll always be there. And my attitude towards that is, well, if you go back 100 years, that's what they thought in Detroit. Detroit was the Silicon Valley of its era, attracting the venture capital, the entrepreneurial geniuses, and all this. And look what happened to Detroit, because they took it for granted. They assumed it would always be there. And we should not always assume that these economic mainstays will always be there, because they are globally competitive. And if we don't compete successfully to keep those businesses operating, we will all suffer the result. The taxes will go down, the jobs will go down, and particularly that the logistics industry of Southern California provides employment for hundreds of thousands of people who do not have very high skills or education levels, working in warehouses, driving trucks, that sort of thing. If you want to take those jobs away, where do those people go? And how do they live? And we're playing with this. It's like playing with fire, and you can get burned. The transition that is the official state policy of California might be, morally defensible, but if we render our economy uncompetitive while the rest of the world isn't doing the same thing, we can kill all of that. We can kill the golden geese very, very easily.
With California depending on 150,000 top earners, and a lot of them start thinking, hey, they're going to move on. You see a lot of that too, not only the top earners, but as they get to a certain age, pass away or leave, the next generation definitely will move on with the capital gains. Do you see like a structural change coming though, where we would be able to do something different in California? You think it has to hit a rock bottom before they start really trying to look at I guess more from a tax structure, it's so progressive that it potentially mires itself to be very sensitive to economic.
We're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
We're seeing it right now in the state having a record high budget deficit, because there was a slight surge in revenues coming out of the pandemic back in 2022, and the state bean counters decided that it was going to go on forever, and it didn't go on forever. It was just a short-term thing. And they made what is acknowledged in the state budget to be a $165 billion mistake.
Wow.
Overestimating revenues over a 4-year period by $165 billion. And when the governor came out back in 2022 and said they have a record high surplus of $97 billion, well, of course, people wanted to spend that money.
Yeah.
Well, it never occurred. It was a projection of these continued high revenues that never occurred. And that $97 billion got lost in that $165 billion mistake.
Wow. Yeah.
So we're seeing it already. We're seeing the dangers of depending on such a narrow base of taxation that anything can disrupt that, including a pandemic. Almost anything can disrupt it. And yet the legislature says, not the whole legislature, but a number of legislators say, well, let's raise the taxes on those folks a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what seems counter is like 13% state income tax, like you said, the highest.
13.3%.
Yeah, in the nation. Yeah.
At much. twice as high as the next highest state, which is New York.
Yeah.
And at some point, there's going to be a backlash. If there is a backlash already, it's a kind of a quiet backlash. People don't advertise it, but there are folks here in California who act as consultants, telling rich people how they can leave California legally and transfer their income to another state, and all the things you have to do to qualify. You have to get new driver's licenses, re-register your vehicle, register to vote in the other state, and establish your residence. So then your mansion in Hillsborough becomes your weekend place, while your ski lodge up at Incline Village in Tahoe becomes your official residence in the state of Nevada.
Yeah.
And there is, in fact, quite a colony of expatriates, Californians, who call Incline Village their homes these days.
Right. Part of my background, I was I'd helped Toyota move to Plano, Texas, and I do a lot of corporate restructuring. I work in the federal side for IBM now, but and then before at Price Waterhouse, this management consulting firm, national or internationally, I did a lot of restructuring, moving people or businesses to parts of Europe, like Switzerland, that had a low effective tax rate. So definitely people go mobile through this process. But I was just curious, like what you're talking about. You can go to some of these states, zero income tax. You're starting to see that out-migration in pretty significant numbers, but it's starting to switch those states around. So the benefit that they hope to be able to maintain in some of the states is starting to affect. My brother moved to Arizona, and there's a real backlash in Arizona for people that move from California.
Also in Idaho and Oregon and a lot of other places.
I'm seeing that in Texas too.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of interesting.
Well, the numbers are not so huge that they're really going to make that big a change, at least yet.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about it. In Colorado is another place that people come to, but it's the fact is that the economy is no longer rooted in physical things.
Right.
How much land you have or what buildings you have. The economy is rooted in the blips on the computer screen.
Right.
And those can be taken anywhere and gone anywhere and done anywhere. And then California tax collectors try to challenge that whenever they can and collect those taxes whenever they can. But underlying this thing is that if your entire state budget is dangerously dependent on a handful of people whose incomes change and who can change their incomes voluntarily, it's dangerous. I mean, and nobody wants to try to do something about it, even though every governor comes along and talks about volatility. In fact, Gavin Newsom blamed volatility for that $165 billion error. Well, it really wasn't. It was just an error. It was just a mistake, an assumption. But nobody wants to do anything about that volatility because it would require restructuring the tax system in a way that would be less dependent on rich people. And to many, that's a no-no.
Right.
And so they're willing to take the chance, as it were, to continue this kind of house of cards situation, but it could collapse. And we're in one of those episodes right now, and it happens periodically. The state gets itself into big trouble because it based on a very narrow shelf of income.
So Dan, I got a question. When you look, there's two views that I see in California, and I've talked to a lot of people on my show. Had Lou Correa, Democrat from Orange County, Michelle Steele, Republican from Orange County, a lot of different business owners. When I've been doing some of my shows from California, you get kind of two different views of where we're heading, and I'm just kind of curious on your perspective. One view is, because of the regulations, the economic policies, doom and gloom, it's all bad. And then on another side, you get, hey, we are the fifth largest economy. We have $3.5 trillion economy is thriving. It's all good. Everything's good. And the future is unbelievable. And so, obviously I've chose to stay. You can vote with your feet and leave. What's your perspective, and where do you see this going?
I tend to have a somewhat negative view of California's future because I think it is neglecting some of the fundamentals that are necessary for prosperity. The flip side of that $3.5 or $3.6 trillion economy is that we have the highest unemployment rate of any state in the United States. We have the highest rate of poverty of any state in the United States. We have an immense problem with housing and a lot of fundamental issues that go into prosperity and we have an education system that is not doing a very good job with children in the K-12 range. We have some of the lowest test scores in the country. We're down there with Mississippi and places like that when it comes to reading comprehension and mathematics and things. These are fundamentals. We have the second worst roadway pavement conditions in the country, and we have factors that are the reason. Well, turn it around. The reason California was so prosperous for so long, and began booming in the post-World War II era, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, was that our fundamentals were good. We had an excellent school system. We had a great system of higher education that was virtually free of charge to students. Our highways, we used to send highway builders all over the world to teach them how to do it because we were so good at it. We were taking care of our water supply and these kind of fundamentals that then free up people to innovate and become prosperous and entrepreneurs and that sort of thing. And the problem, as I said before, is we're neglecting those fundamentals now. And we're in danger of killing the golden goose, of driving out the logistics industry, of having the high-tech industry expand elsewhere, but not in California. That layoffs in the high-tech industry in the Bay Area have been prodigious over the last couple of years. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs there.
I was in San Jose two or 3 weeks ago, and then 2 months ago, and it's a ghost town. Yeah. It used to be so thriving.
And that's. I was looking at some employment data just this week, and California showed a pretty good surge of employment, even though we still have a very high unemployment rate, relatively. And then the data, you dig deeper down, you find that 90% of that was government.
Wow.
The private economy had added almost nothing. And virtually all of the growth in employment was in government services, which, of course, are not, they don't produce anything.
Right.
And they don't add wealth. They don't add value. And you prosper when you have value-added industries that take raw materials and assemble them into new products and that sort of thing. And that's what made California great.
Right.
And we're not doing so well on that anymore. And unfortunately, the political climate is such that the reigning party kind of ignores all of that. They just assume that it's all going to be there, and you can tax it more, you can put more regulations on it, you can force it to do this and force it to do that, and there will be no adverse consequence as a result of that. Well, we saw one recently. They put some new stuff on oil refineries, and the very next day, Phillips says they're shutting down their refinery in Southern California. And Vallejo has given notice that they may shut down 2 more refineries. We only have 9 refineries to begin with. We used to have like 30.
Yeah.
And now we're down to about 9. And nobody else produces the gasoline that's mandated in California because our gasoline is different from everybody else. We could have some really
which will just
huge
increase the
disruptions.
price. Yeah. Increase the price.
And there's this kind of strange notion in the body politic that you don't have to worry about economics. That it's all going to be there. It's always going to be there. It's never going to go away. And yet, funny thing is, they're raising the red flags about the entertainment industry, but the entertainment industry is finding itself in a competitive situation, and now wants subsidies from the state, or it's bigger subsidies from the state. And yet, we have other industries that are equally cloudy. And we just kind of take them for granted that they'll be okay. It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. that California can neglect its fundamentals, let the highways deteriorate, let the water system, age and not be adequate, and so on and so forth, and start charging huge tuitions to college students and having too many kids at the lower levels who are not reading and writing and doing arithmetic well. Mm-hmm. And somehow we're going to escape the consequences of that. But I think if I were ever to write another book about California, which I'm not going to do because it's hard work and I'm too old and too lazy to do it, I would call it Unintended Consequences. Because if you look at political decision making in the whole, in the largest context, a lot of things are done that have consequences that nobody intended, but happened. Mm-hmm. Some good, some bad. But politics is a short-range business. Long range in politics is the next election cycle. And the idea is to do what you want to do to do it now and not worry about the consequences later. But things do have consequences. How did our tax system evolve from one dependent on sales taxes, which it was 50 years ago, and to one dependent on income taxes? Did anybody make that decision? No. But nobody was watching it either and seeing the dangers of the consequences of that occurring. Now we are seeing the consequences in the terms of revenue volatility and budget deficits and that sort of thing. But I can remember writing about this evolution of the taxation system back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And it was like, nobody was paying any attention to it. It was not a problem. Mm-hmm. And that is short-range political decision-making with no sense of potential consequences is a very, very dangerous thing. And we're seeing, I think, more and more of that. Putting a new minimum wage on fast food, that has consequences. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not a huge industry or anything, but it has consequences. Mm-hmm. It inevitably is going to result in fewer jobs or higher prices or whatever the consequences are. To believe that you can do it without consequences mm-hmm. is faulty. It's burying your head in the sand, and we should pay more attention to the potential consequences of these decisions that are made either in the legislature or by voters for their potential downside risks. I mean, it's just a matter of risk management. It's mm-hmm. basic. It's basics, right? Yeah. Risk management, due diligence, that mm-hmm. sort of thing. Instead, we see this thing, headline grabbing thing. Oh, let's go raise the mm-hmm. minimum wage on fast food, and they get all this headlines and blah blah blah. But there are consequences, right? And somebody will pay for those consequences in some way, either in terms of less employment or higher prices or some combination thereof. Or fewer fast food places. I'm seeing a lot of them been shut down in my neighborhood lately. But politicians just don't have that kind of willingness to do. I think that there was at one time, when I first started covering politics back in the 70s, there was a lot of consideration given to longer term mm-hmm. matters, mostly in the positive sense. What can we do now to make things mm-hmm. better? What improvements can we make in water or the highway system or whatever it might be? And I don't see that anymore. I think that may be a consequence of term limits. Yeah. It may be a consequence of one-party rule. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But there's an awful lot of kind of ad hoc decision-making going on without not even trying to figure out what the consequences mm-hmm. would be. Now, they do have people on staff who try to do these things, but usually they're ignored. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we talked earlier about this subsidy for the motion picture industry. The legislative analyst's office, an arm of the legislature, who they're kind of the fiscal watchdogs, wrote a whole paper about that a year ago about mm-hmm. the potential consequences of increasing the subsidies to the film industry. Right. And put it in context. Well, nobody paid any attention to it. it's something that the industry wanted. They were crying and moaning and groaning about it. So the governor and the legislature figured they had to do it, and they are doing it. And what will be the consequence of that? I don't know.
Dan, I got my last question. After hearing all that, do you see any potential that anytime in the future that California goes back to a two-party system?
Probably not. I think it's baked in pretty strongly. There's the battles that'll be going on, are going on, have been going on, and will go on is within the Democratic Party. One of my pet political theories is that anytime you have a one-party situation, like the Republicans in Orange County back in the day, or the Democrats in San Francisco, when you have a one-party stranglehold on a city or a county or a state, that party starts devolving into factions. But you can call them pseudo-parties or quasi-parties based on ethnicity, geography, ideology, gender, whatever it might be. But you start seeing the evolution of these internal quasi-parties, and we see that now among the Democrats very strongly. And so the battles will be fought at that level for the foreseeable future. It would be, unless there's some cataclysmic event, an X factor that comes along that nobody could foresee. I think the rest of my life, which not that many years, but for a long time, we're just going to see the struggles, the political struggles in California will be within the Democratic Party. And you can see them in this year's election. A lot of Democrat versus Democrat campaigns going on.
Yeah, brutal too.
And the business-oriented Democrats versus the progressive or something like that. And they can get very the worst fights are within families, right?
That's very true. That is very true.
The grudges are held the longest within the family, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's true of politics as well. I mean, there was a huge battle among Democrats 44 years ago for the speakership of the state assembly. And the two factions just went tooth and nail for a year, and it was just brutal. And today, the aging gladiators from that race still talk about it, are still bearing grudges about that.
That long ago.
Oh, that long ago, yeah. And so, that's the thing to watch for. And the lobbyist community within the Capitol, the people who represent various interest groups, and there are about 1,200 or something lobbyists and maybe 10,000 or 20,000 interest groups. They understand that. And so they look for the fault lines within the Democratic Party to build their alliances to either pass or defeat legislation with remarkable success in some cases. The oil industry does well within the legislature, for example, much to the chagrin of the governor. That's where you're going to see the fights. California is going to be one of those. It's a one-party state, and it's going to be a one-party state for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, Dan, I just wanted to tell you, I really appreciate you being on the show.
Sure.
I've really enjoyed this discussion, and a lot of the questions that I've had for you, I've really wondered, where is the future of California going? And if somebody that from your level has been able to cover it for so long, you can see the trends. You don't buy off on the sugar highs. You can see kind of through that stuff. It's very helpful. Yeah,
it's if whatever happens in California, it's going to be a fascinating thing to see.
Yeah,
fascinatingly good or fascinatingly bad, I guess, but it's going to be fascinatingly.
Yeah, well, let's hope for the best, right?
All right.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.